All right, welcome everybody. I'm sure we'll get some more people kind of joining in, but to respect the time, let's get started. I know I sent in something out thanks to Dennis's leadership here. He sent some charts out that he prepared for. He did a lot of reference material, look at investigation into things, some topics that I think are good to foster here. And then the intention here is for us to interact and figure out, given the lay of the land here and the fact that we've discussed zero trust being a transitional state, and because of that, there's going to be a lot of mixed zero trust, non-zero trust zones in an IT network. That looked like an opportunity for OCA to step in and do something, of which we're still trying to figure out exactly what. But it seemed like a good, relevant place to address and help foster people moving in the direction of zero trust, because it does seem like a relatively sophisticated roadmap that I've seen in order to do this correctly. So anyway, that's the scope we're on, and Dennis's charts does an excellent job doing some nice background research and things he found, and he's fostered up a few questions. And if you remember, I asked you guys to take a look at some of his suggested next steps, which we'll talk about toward the end. With that, I'll turn it over to Dennis. Thank you.
And can you see the deck now? And how's the audio?
You put it in screen show mode would be great. Otherwise, all we see is the PowerPoint, like the slides on the left and down the bottom. Down the bottom, you see the little viewer. That's perfect.
All right. This works?
Yeah, that's full screen. You can make a screen larger.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. But yeah, that works. Now all we're seeing is your zero trust principles first page, which is perfect.
Is that sizing any better?
Okay. That's good to me. How about you guys?
It's good.
All right.
Okay, just for context, that we're focusing on sort of the intersection between zero trust and non-zero trust stuff. It became an interesting adjacent question to understand. Well, for that non-zero trust stuff, how do we cobble together some common ground there, so that policy and posture and an understanding of what the consequences of integration of zero trust and non-zero trust stuff would be. It would be good to understand how the playing field is being conditioned to make that possible. And so this is a dive into one of those dimensions that are a consequence of the U.S. executive order. It is an area being discussed now in IETF and a few other places where the standards groups are getting together to reconcile their various zero trust roadmaps, but to deal with the core first step issues. So to set this up, I'm going to echo the initial perspective, and then we'll go from there. So that initial perspective comes directly from observations in the CISA guidance of the executive order. If you remember, CISA published a document on the zero trust maturity model, which was an attempt to step back and understand where are people now, that row that you see in the traditional domain, what are steps they can make that are definitively steps in the direction of zero trust, but not yet at zero trust in terms of resilience or the level of security they propose. And then this last line saying optimal, which is their way of saying it's directional to get to zero trust. There probably isn't a finish line. There's just successive progression toward that steering post on the horizon. And that's because of the emergence of new vulnerabilities and compromises of those vulnerabilities, even in the mechanisms that are used to establish zero trust. In that, there was some clear information that zero trust takes time. These are the canonical steps in getting to zero trust, and they're echoed in lots of places. They are intrusive. They are exhaustive, if not exhausting, in what has to happen at the rate of new systems capabilities being generated. Lots and lots of this stuff requires you always having your fingers on the pulse of all the subjects in an enterprise, all the assets they might need access to, the classification of all of those things, and the potential business impact as a consequence of both the classification and the dependency on business policies, formulating the potential policy statements based on all of that externalized information, and then figuring out how to map it into coherent implementation that is reflected by the isolation encryption, and then control and detection mechanisms that go into the infrastructure. That takes time. As a consequence, there's a clear recognition in the same CISA document that the path to zero trust is incremental and it will take years to implement, and many systems in the third highlighted area won't make it. That is, they'll have to be rebuilt or replaced in order to approach zero trust. What that raised the question of is, of course, what do you do about the systems that are operating today, whose vulnerability and exploit profiles we can't tolerate? There was a companion set of guidance that came out from NIST aimed precisely at this domain, called the security measures for existing systems or systems in use. And the intention was to apply zero trust principles to systems that weren't going to be re-architected or replaced, and that needed to make some headway now, but headway that was going to result in a system that could be consistent with the policy management that would result from zero trust implementations. It was intended to be implemented immediately. So you see the mandate from the executive order said you got 30 days to figure out how to mandate agencies comply with the guidance that's in this. Secure in use is one of the contractions you'll hear this referred to as. The link to the guidance is at the top of this, right under the FAQ statement. But there is also the clear recognition that these are measures for critical software defined in the guidance, and they will be components of a zero trust architecture, but they're by no means a complete implementation of a zero trust architecture, precisely because they needed to be implemented now and without re-architecting or replacing the existing systems. With that in mind, what was established is a number of objectives that were intended to apply zero trust consistent measures, security measures, but absent having gone all the way through re-architecting for zero trust. So what I wanted to do was to take this list of objectives, and I think there are 5 primary objectives with a few security measures on each of them, translate them into something easier to interpret. I'll give you an example of what that is here, so that we understand what are the provisions that were there. In that first objective, for instance, there was the requirement that multi-factor authentication be used, and that was to mitigate the challenge of losing other ways of getting authentic or not having control of other ways of getting authentication to happen. To establish coherent identifiers, not just for users, but for all the non-user entities that are credentialed in interacting in an environment, from service accounts to the things behind the usage of API keys to get privilege, and all of so the derived stuff as well. The hosting of the critical software on hardened platforms for the critical software components, and having pervasive logging associated with those platforms. And finally, the establishment of reinforcement around the containment provided by those hardened platforms with mechanisms like segmentation and/or software-defined networking, or isolation of other forms, or proxies intervening where you can control the accessibility to the links themselves. In all of those cases, this sort of summarizes what's there, but it also highlights what's the differences between that and pure zero trust that is aiming for what the definition is in SP 800-207, but also behind the UK and CSC zero trust architectural guidelines, and the guidelines that ENISA seems to be focusing on as well, all of which are that more intrusive version of zero trust, intended specifically to have traction against inside-out attacks, attacks that come in the supply chain that use unknown or previously unrecognized exploit mechanisms. That resilience against those two things wind up being fundamental to having at-scale protection against both ransomware and supply chain attacks. The differences from zero trust are that the boundary, if I'm not going to re-architect an existing application, then I'm not going to get it down to a place where I can isolate it by container. So it's coarser granularity. The boundary that gets created on which the controls are placed isn't so small. In fact, in many cases, it's going to be the size of a conventionally architected application, which means the attack surface is huge, and the ability, once infected on the inside, to move around a lot becomes very large as well. There is no intra application visibility because there's no intra application instrumentation or telemetry unless it's provided ad hoc. But because of the lack of isolation, it's always at risk. That is, the cameras can be controlled at that point. And of course, the platform verification prior to use for the hardening is limited because many of the conventionally architected applications are big and span CPUs. So things like systems of trust anchors, not just TPMs, but also the trust anchors around authentication and application integrity would have to be cobbled together. So significant differences from zero trust, but an application of zero trust consistent principles to conventionally architected systems, giving us an underlying vocabulary that then we can do some alignment with. We could say, if I integrated a system that applied all of the security measures identified in this document, starting with objective 1, then I've got some common ground, some places where at least I understand equivalences in the other system, that being pure zero trust. And so a way to connect the dots between non-zero trust systems that apply these security measures and zero trust systems that let me understand something about the relationship between both the attestations and the dynamics of the system in terms of the protection that's provided or the resilience that's provided. So that was the theory behind this stuff. And that led to a couple of questions. But first, before I do that, let me suggest that what I'd like to do going from here is to pull out one of these summarizing diagrams for each of the objectives, trying to capture the security measures in a way that we're not just constantly wading through the regulatory ease, if that makes sense. And then separately, identify, as we did with the first one, the differences from a completely conformant zero trust pursuit that might be the application of 800-207 to any trust domain you pick to try to move it towards zero trust. And then add to that, once we have this sort of normalizing definition, one that's being used to guide the commercial efforts, but also one that sort of gives us an independent common base through which to look at it. I'd like to compare it to the Microsoft guidance on the application of zero trust to existing systems, Amazon's analog to the same thing. I haven't found the document yet that Google has used in this domain, but there may be others. So the question is, do these next steps make sense to the group as a whole? And does the content that I've put together so far seem useful in making headway on at least identifying what zero trust versus non-zero trust means, and maybe looking at how zero trust principles get applied to in a more fractional or partial or limited way to existing systems. And since I've been working on this, I'm getting tunnel vision and sort of need your feedback on that.
So Dennis, this is Jason Keenahan from, I'm part of IBM Security. So first, thanks for pulling this together. I think it's a good start and a way for us to begin to have the conversation. I think getting that initial straw man down is always kind of the toughest part for us to be able to start working from. So I think that this is great. So if I kind of just play back a little bit about what you took us through here. So first, an initial premise is that existing systems cannot achieve pure, I don't know if that's the right word, but cannot get to pure zero trust.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. If you follow 800-207 literally, then it requires the ability to split the components of the system up into places where you can know an awful lot that you can't know about coarser levels of granularity. The conclusion has resulted in all of the implementations to date that are used as zero trust reference architectures using a granularity of about container size. But there are many systems that you can't break apart into containers in that sense, right? Unless I wrap one gigantic container around, for instance, SAP. There is I've got to decompose it in order to be able to do what they're asking. And then I've got to have that completeness of coverage of all of the subjects and all of the objects. If you don't, then you leave a gaping hole in the argument that this provides resilience to those supply chain style attacks. And then there is all of the stuff about the continuous, the always inline and real time independent verification. Those are pretty intrusive and won't make their ways into conventionally architected systems who on multiple of those fronts are going to have a real challenge getting there. And I am thinking about the large monolithic systems that are 3-tier with lots of external dependencies and integrations that evolved, like enterprise ERP systems, are one classic example. But there are many, many other medical systems, the medical information and tracking systems. In all of those domains, you don't have the building blocks of the architectural structure to realize the NIST reference architecture, much less the DoD zero trust reference architectures. So the recognition here from CISA is that you wind up having to rebuild it in order to be able to get it there. But it is part granularity, part connectivity and attack surface complexity, part the exhaustiveness with which you need to know things like the provenance of the code, the testedness, and therefore the policy you can put on its logical boundary. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. I just want to make sure though that I don't know if it's so black and white, and I just want to make sure that like we're not coming across as saying, hey, you can't have true zero trust unless you're rebuilding everything from scratch, or you're rebuilding everything in a cloud native, format.
Maybe cloud friendly would be the, because you certainly can do Kubernetes on premise, right? So the definition as NIST articulated it is pretty black and white. The door they left open was something called hybrid zero trust, which is doing zero trust without all of the things lining up. But to do that, you wind up compensating in areas by limiting, for instance, what is the injection of code you didn't develop into the domains, or the amount of scrutiny that goes into code that comes from your development team in terms of the observation of the logging and testing as part of the policy predicates that you realize at runtime. So you wind up exposing more of the things you couldn't control by using resilience and decomposition mechanisms, if that makes sense. But the anticipation is policy simpler about a microservice because it's so small and has such a tight focus. So understanding what it should do is a whole lot easier than doing the same thing for a great big honking million line component of some sort, if that makes sense. That's just the visual rationale behind the scenes that keeps popping up in the conversation. Now, there is a set of audit criteria identified by the NCCOE as part of that collaboratory exercise going on, where they're going to evaluate the degree of conformance and the effectiveness of zero trust implementations using existing technologies. And there are a grid of like three tables of controls that are intended to be sort of the litmus test of, are you on the right track and how does this compare? Where it gets a little more concrete there. But none of the zero trust definitional stuff seems very relaxed. I've seen none of the reference architectures attempt to embrace a conventionally architected multi-tiered application as a single zero trust entity, if that makes sense, a single zero trust subject in an environment.
This is Russ, Dennis. I mean, I do love the fact that somebody's actually had some granularity to an audit criteria. That sounds awesome. And then what I was thinking of, Dennis, is your chart on the maturity model. Can you go back to the zero trust maturity model from
Oh yeah,
CISA?
that's up here.
That's
Whoops.
my favorite. I love pictures, but that's me. I'm thinking of what you just said, and I see this. And one of the things I could think we may approach this problem at is zero trust is fairly encompassing and large and complex. And as you stated, there's going to be some sophisticated systems that may never get there just because of the complexities or the difficulties of doing so. So the thing I was thinking, if I was an implementer, if I was a customer, I would pick a project. And I would then start taking this nice little model here and figure out how I evolve from traditional to advanced to optimal. And what I was thinking is and then you've got this nice this criteria for effectiveness and conformance. I'm wondering if we were focused, for example, on helping people take pieces of their environment, get them to zero trust through the maturity model and this effectiveness thing you were talking about. Is that a way we can think about helping people get there?
I think it is, but I think it also mixes together with that other piece, which is the thing that says I've got critical systems that aren't going to be re-architected or replaced anytime soon, that have to play in the game. What do I need to do to enable their integration with zero trust environments so I know their impact on the posture of the resulting integrated system, if that makes sense? And that's sort of what I focused on in this. A separate mode is one that says, oh, I've got this big honking thing. I want to replace or redevelop it. There are many efforts for large systems to try to turn them into microservices. Many of those fail. There is that how do I modernize the application in that broad sense kind of effort, and that has funding too. But I didn't make that part of at least the scope of what I tried to address here. I think you're right that there's going to be an awful lot of help needed. The latest Office of Management and Budget mandate to all federal agencies, we have this in draft, has mandated progress on the planning and discovery and identification who the point person is. More than anything else, no mandate in sight to show me a zero trust policy. Showing a zero trust plan that moves in this direction where the target is optimal and the intermediate steps are in advanced are the requirements for all of the federal space. And that when it becomes an M-Series memo, will gate access to budgets and will be reflected in the acquisition regulations, the FARs.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But the key issue is that zero trust is that bottom line. And if you take literally the stuff that's there for continuous validation, for instance, that's real time and inline. And we have lots of systems that can't tolerate that by itself, much less the impact of the other mechanisms here.
Oh, certainly so. But I was just thinking again, as we try and help visibility, I'm thinking more visibility of stuff. And that's kind of why I like your model. I think visibility and analytics is going to help people see what they have and what they don't have.
That is absolutely critical because most agencies do not know first what they have, separately, who's there and what they are doing, much less who's there and what should they or should they not be doing. We're at the front end of this journey, which, as CISA says, will require years for an arbitrary agency wanting to get to zero trust, and an arbitrary company actually wanting to do the same thing, because of the motivation being supply chain and ransomware attacks, which are at unprecedented levels last year and still nasty.
And by the way, are you looking at the chat, Dennis? Because Brian.
Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah, Brian, I think is not audio, but he's certainly very active in the chat.
I with this presentation thing, I'm trying to find out how I turn on my chat channel here. Oh, different thumbnails.
Yeah, there should be a little, looks like a cartoon with a little speaker on it down the right side there. next to the people. It says participants, and then right to the right should be a chat.
Um,
Bottom right, I think.
Actually, I think when he's screen sharing, so he doesn't have that view.
that's what's going on.
Oh,
It's in the drop
You've
down
got a bar
now.
at the top.
Yeah. Oh, it's in the
Yeah.
drop down. That's where they hit it. Okay. Yeah, you're right, Jason. It's not in the. Yeah, it's somewhere
Okay.
around there. It's in the edge somewhere.
And then I've got to stretch it to see because it's
Because Brian and I were chatting a little about this, the maturity model that we were just talking about, and in the chat.
Oh, got it now. Yes.
Yeah. Find it. Good.
Yes. Yeah, I think people are going to decide what things are going to go to a hybrid model for the foreseeable future. That in which they don't want to bite off re-implementation or re-architecting or replacement. And for those systems, a hybrid zero trust model that follows something like that NIST guidance with the objectives we just described, I think is the most plausible way of having something that doesn't just get walled off in a closet, but instead is still integrable into zero trust systems that are fully conformant. And it's just because you establish some commonality of the security primitives. And that builds the ability to have a policy statement that can go across a zero trust and a non-zero trust domain. But I think you will always have multiple trust domains, some of which will fit into the zero trust model and some of which certainly won't, and there'll be at least one, maybe multiple non-zero trust domains that have different criteria, but that are well understood. So you know what it does, what you're doing to yourself when you integrate the two systems from a posture and an attestation perspective. The diagram that's being commented on is the maturity model diagram from CISA, right? I believe.
Right, that's right. Yeah, we were just debating that. Exactly.
Yeah, it's intended to be motivating and carefully labeled. It could have been much more confrontational. But yeah, I think that's very right. So at any rate, let's hold on that, and let me get to the last ask of this, and that was things for us to consider going forward that I think are going to be important. Go back to reading. Whoops. Sorry for redundantly. I scrolled so fast, I bounced right out of. Maybe I can just do it this way. No. There is no go to the last page button. Oh, I know. I probably went off the end and it bounced out of this reading view when I did. So I will totally.
You're almost there. There you go.
So the emerging guidance that I'm referring to here is both the NIST guidance on securing existing systems, those that have not been re-architected or too big to fit the compliance, or too complex to fit the conformance to the current NIST definition for zero trust. So the question was, does the other guidance, like what Microsoft does, what Amazon does, both in their zero trust reference models that aren't so constrained by the NIST definition, that have clear ability to be extended to existing systems, do they provide the right set of abstractions? The kinds of things that are surfacing in common to all of them is a focus on the isolation boundaries that reinforce container boundaries, but also reinforce things that don't fit into containers, sort of software-defined perimeters that have clear gates of control from firewalls across the board to things that are more behavioral in their character or more expressive in the kinds of behavior or at different levels. A focus on authentication and verification concurrently. That is that the verification questions the assumption behind authentication, but as well as integrity, as well as every other assertion that can be made at any one point in time. That continuous verification seems to be a consistent part of all of their guidances of applying zero trust principles to even existing and conventionally designed systems. Trustability of the platform seemed to be part and parcel. That seems to be as much understanding things like safe boot and the things that tell you about the provenance of the parts that went into the system So the confidence that there isn't rogue firmware or modification of critical components, authenticated code modules, all the stuff under the covers and inside the motherboard. And then, of course, the completeness. The idea that instead of having open-ended, complex, conventional systems that face the internet, that you do have some understanding of the users who have access to complex systems that probably have an unending stream of exploitable vulnerabilities, that you don't want those exposed until you know something about the accessor, and preferably a lot about the accessor as far as zero trust is concerned anyway. And then the question then would be, what are the, if I have such a system that relaxes some of the zero trust constraints in order to be applicable to existing systems, what are the constraints on the integration? Is there a directional integration challenge that says it can only read from such systems as opposed to populating them with potentially sensitive information? Are there restrictions on the changes? If we can't get DevSecOps team publishing the 11 security tests for every release and every build as part of something that's testable at runtime, what is the level of control we need on the supply chain feeding the more complex, less instrumented, less compartmentalized systems? And then, of course, on policy and detection, what is the resulting policy? If I have zero trust policy in one domain, not quite zero trust policy in another, let's say hybrid zero trust, what is a policy statement across them result in? What is the character of that higher level policy statement? It knows less about the non-zero trust domain to some extent, or at least from a zero trust rationale. So those are some questions that I think we should probably use to help both constrain and inform what we decide to do as a consequence of this. I know we're still in the mode of collecting base data, understanding where is the industry's head at right now, where is the regulatory head at right now, given that we've just had the EU NIS2 vote and that we have some progress in the UK's zero trust definition. I think we're also getting an international feel for where this is headed, and with what kind of convergence, what kind of agreement, what kind of normalization. With that, I think we have the context then to decide what is it that we feel is both doable and that we're motivated to move on, if that makes sense. So I'll shut now and be open to any feedback. And without objections, what I'll just do is refine this, continue to fill it out, bring in the commercial sector application of zero trust principles to non-zero trust code. Microsoft is weighed in there, so has Amazon. Others are also doing so. We're beginning to get some insight from the NCCOE on the collaboration as they get the first round of architectural implementation and the endpoint discussions settled, or at least initiated and launched. And then we'll have more on the feedback of how the guidance has shifted with the feedback that the public comment that's come back to NIST, to CISA, to the NSA, and to other folks on what they've said about responding, in particular to the executive order. So we're going to have a lot more information as we begin distilling this. The challenge is focusing on the right chunks of it for us in a way that's actionable and that reins in the scope. Right now, the scope is pretty big, but we're discovering where we can contribute, I believe.
So Dennis, if we take kind of the initial, next steps of taking those 5 objectives and diagramming out, in a more consumable fashion, what would you expect us to? What would we do with that after we've created those?
So what I'm hoping is they're concise enough representation of applying zero trust principles to a system that isn't it isn't anticipated it will be able to get all the way to zero trust. So it'll be the canonical zero trust and non-zero trust systems that we would, from that point, be able to see what are the commonalities between fully zero trust conformant and a system that's envisioned by this set of security measures in this deck, one that isn't. That gives us the basis for asking the question, all right, what then is the result of integration of those systems? How do you combine zero trust and non-zero trust? I think you get some headway by knowing what the vocabulary is in each of those two domains. Does that make sense?
Okay.
All it says is what are the commonalities? But I wanted to get a better read on the commonalities than just distillation of NISTs, which is what this deck has been about so far, to also looking at what Microsoft's rationale is behind this. Because they weighed in early and heavy on applying zero trust to existing systems in some ways. I just haven't gone through that stuff in detail. In fact, I'm hoping it didn't get retracted because I'm having a little bit of problem refinding it, but I stashed it.
I was just going to ask if you had a link to any of that material on the Microsoft.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. Yeah, I'd love to get up to speed as well.
I have a stale one. I'll try to get one that's active. That will be my first order of business, actually, to begin getting the commercial part filled out. I do have the reference architectures for both Microsoft and Amazon for their conditioned infrastructure for zero trust.
That'd be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely seen the stuff. I know that Microsoft has a ton of valuable content, I think, from the zero trust perspective, as well, especially like, kind of their reference architecture that they have and such. I think is all very good. I mean, obviously it's a Microsoft centric view, but I think it aligns very nicely and highlights a lot of the key kind of integrations and things that are necessary in an overall architecture. So
yeah, completely agreed. They also focused on helping with the journey into their customer base, recognizing that this is big and intrusive, and it's going to take time.
So so how can we help progress or divide and conquer on some of these?
As I get these diagrams done, intermediate feedback before the next meeting would really help, or your annotation or your inspiration about better ways to do these. I'm just sort of capturing things and trying to do it in ways that make sense to me. That doesn't mean they make sense to anybody else. So that kind of collaborative consideration of this and contribution, if you have any, would be really interesting. If this is an okay outline for the next iteration, then that kind of population would help. If you find things that I don't about Microsoft's weighing in on zero trust plus non-zero trust in some ways, or Amazon or Google or Red Hat or anybody else that you feel has a place to stand in this, that would be IBM, for instance. You probably have folks at TJ Watson who live and breathe this stuff all day long at the policy level that might be very interesting. I just haven't been trolling the research literature at all. I've been looking for what's hitting the streets and what's the standards communities doing.
Yeah. No. I think those are good places for us to focus, for sure.
And Dennis, did you see? We did have one person, Duncan, looked at the stuff before the meeting and emailed all of us on the distribution channel and his feedback. Did you see that?
No, I didn't. I've sort of been back to back, but I will right after this.
All right, because here I could paste it in here.
Oh, great.
It's right in front of me because I know somebody did some homework on it and came back. I said, "Oh, this is great." There you go. It's in the chat. Some of it I read and I wasn't quite sure where he was coming from because he started talking about it's not Azure or it's not binary, and we knew that. So yeah.
Yeah, zero trust is notoriously not.
Yeah, we agree with that. Yeah.
Well, the predicates are very discrete. When it says test authorization, it's asking for independent verification of the authorization. There is a relevance of in this case, sort of EDR-ish capability, I think is being referred to well, at least what stick shifter could give you. And that would be the end. Do I see reasons to doubt the posture of the application or the underlying platform? That's something Sticks is used to communicate all the time.
Right.
So if I see IOCs, despite the fact that I know I provisioned it rock solid secure, yet I see indicators of compromise, that is a reason to question the underlying hosting platform for a microservice or the device on which a user is, from which a user is acting. And you might have zero trust policy react to such insight. That is envisioned certainly in the definition, if that makes sense. But there is, I have seen no reference models that do anything but refer to that level of instrumentation as an indication or an alert. They really don't go through any effort to connect the dots between what I see from Sticks and what I know from my policy assertion. How the semantics get connected is left as an exercise to the user with lots of hand waving.
Yeah, that's why they just fish up the raw data and let it available for somebody to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
Which is I mean, it's a necessary condition, I guess. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary.
Yeah, the hope is that you can at least focus it and say, if I get an alert, I can tell if it's about the integrity of the asset or about the trustworthiness or the trustability of a user's credential. If I can do that, then at least I know where to route the alert in the assessment of the trust anchors. And that could tell me what I allow or don't allow in my policy. But that takes some serious talking about how this stuff is supposed to work together. And not all of that's there yet in the either the guidance, the definitions, or the results. I think that's part of what NCCOE is hoping to explore is how do you get in a concrete way connect the dots of available telemetry and policy assertion and the resulting things like zero trust policy. Work to do, lots of work to do. At any rate, so if no one has a violent objection, I'll work on a refinement of this. You all have, I think you sent out the deck, Russ?
I did, yes. It's sent out to the distribution list. Yep. It's out there.
So
I'll post it to the GitHub.
Yeah. So don't hesitate to contribute or communicate where you want to, or if you want to collaborate on how we move the ball forward in conjunction. Let me know. This is just starting point. It is definitely total phaser fodder. It should be dispensed with when it stops being useful, or when we find something else that's more useful, or decide to focus. So there's no EO wrapped up in this. There's just an attempt to organize an overwhelming amount of data into something we can do something.
And thank you very much, Dennis, for doing that. I really do appreciate it.
Sure, delighted. Russ, back over to you.
Okay, so I think we're wrapped up for today's call. I will set up one more call maybe this year. You guys still around in 2 weeks? I'll do one last call for the year. Is everybody reasonably okay with the 20th? If not, I can wait till January. I mean, it's not a big deal.
I'd say if we can have another call and and collaboratively try to progress what Dennis has put together here, I think that'd be good.
Okay,
so we can start to see kind of the next steps.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'll try and set it up for the 20th then, on 2 weeks from today. That gives us time to work on some stuff too.
That's actually like 3 weeks, isn't it?
Is it?
Yeah. Today's the 29th.
Oh, that's right. It's the third. I'll do the 13th. Thank you. I'll do 12/13. I'll do it 2 weeks from today. That's even better. You're right. My calendar is advanced. Very good. Again, thanks so much, Dennis, for pulling all this together.
It was a hoot. And in the meantime, don't hesitate to ping me on email if you need or want explanation, more detail, or references. I will chase down that original Microsoft reference really quickly.
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Sounds great.
Okay, thanks again. Thanks everybody for participating.
Thanks, Russ.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, Dennis.